Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. It's Matty here, and welcome back to Meta Monday, the weekly series where we analyze the Pokemon Pocket metagame and keep you guys up to date on everything that's going on in the competitive world of Pokemon Pocket. So, this past weekend was the Ursa Days Pocket Weekly number 29, the largest weekly tournament series in Pokemon Pocket, and this was actually the first tournament of the new Extradimensional Crisis metagame, the new format, or ED Crisis for short, as we like to say here on the channel. Yeah, this is going to be a really interesting one. Whenever new formats come out, I think a lot of people are interested to see the results and to, I guess, hear my opinions, or I guess share their opinions on the results and I think what they believe is going on in the format. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to start off, excuse me, by going over the standings, the final standings, and I guess the results of the tournament, and then we're going to go ahead and take a look at the deck lists and talk about them, and then after that, we're going to go into the metagame tab, take a look at the meta share data and the average win rates and everything, and I think that's probably where we're going to explain a lot of the context and information that I think really describes the tournament as a whole and kind of what we're looking at in the metagame. So I know a lot of people just come for the deck lists, but definitely stay tuned for the end where we go into that stuff, because that's kind of really where I think we're going to learn a lot, or I suppose, break the most down. So anyway, guys, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Stay tuned. Tons of Pokemon Pocket content coming on the channel over the next few days. It should be really fun. Honestly, this format is a little bit crazy and things are changing so often in Pokemon Pocket. It really is just an absolutely incredible experience. Okay, let's get right into it. So these are the final standings, what you're looking at here. Yeah, okay, let's just break it down. So this player here, Dot, I guess was his username, from Japan, got first place, went 12-1-1 with Giratina and Darkrai EX. That's right, you saw that correctly. Giratina and Darkrai wins the first Ursa Days tournament of this new format. And then this player here, Verum from Puerto Rico, second place with Buzzwole. Also, this player here, don't know how to say the name, from Spain, also third place with Buzzwole. And then we have Noctis from Mexico, fourth place, also with Buzzwole. And then we have Red Japan from Japan, of course, in fifth place with Solgaleo and Shinodak. I can never say the name right. We have Nabrix from the United States in sixth place here with Sylvally Rampardos. And then we have Shadow Rex from the Netherlands playing Charizard Incineroar. And then we have this player, again, I can't say the names, from Brazil, eighth place, also playing Giratina and Darkrai. Ninth place from the United States, we also have another Sylvally and Rampardos. And if we go down here at a 10th place, we've got a Garchomp, a couple more Buzzwole here, 11th through 13th. We have Guzzlord and Naganadel here at 14th place, another Buzzwole at 15th, and then Sylvally and Rampardos at 16th. So that's it. That's the final standings of the tournament. I believe this was a top 64 cut, so 64 decks ended up making it into day two. We'll take a look at the meta shares in a little bit. And yeah, so maybe something that I guess a lot of people weren't expecting, I should say, with this new format. In the first tournament of this new format is Giratina and Darkrai winning, especially seeing the three decks below Giratina and Darkrai being Buzzwole decks, which are, of course, technically speaking, a great matchup into Giratina and Darkrai. So, you might be wondering, how did this deck end up winning? We'll talk about it. We'll break it all down. But one thing I will say is that, again, I say this all the time, but I want people to not put too much stock in whatever deck ends up winning the tournament. Of course, if you're competing, first place is first place, and that's where all the glory goes. But we're here to analyze the actual metagame and the overall tournament and, what it all means. And I just don't want people to put too much stock in whatever deck gets first place. You might be thinking, oh, Giratina Darkrai is still the best deck, I should go play it. I don't know if that's necessarily the case, especially in ranked battles. It's not really something that I would, I guess, just flat out say is like the number one deck of the format, I should say, even though it did get first place. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Let's take a look at the deck list here. Giratina and Darkrai, man, it's just, we all know what it is. Giratina Darkrai continues to be probably the most consistent deck of the format, the lowest downside, I should say, right? If you take a look at a deck, you've got, your upside and your downside. Some decks have really low downsides and really high upsides. We call those sort of a high roll deck, right? A little bit more RNG focused. And then we've got some really consistent decks, which have really low downsides, but maybe not as high upsides. I think that Giratina and Darkrai has a really low downside. This deck list is actually very interesting. Of course, 2 Darkrai and 2 Giratina. We have showcased some people playing Kamala, like in last format, to counter Oricorio. And then I think a couple days ago, we did showcase a Giratina and Darkrai deck that was playing the new Nihilego with maybe some Poison Barbs. This player not doing really any of that, just playing a straight Giratina and Darkrai package with maximum kind of hand disruption, as we see here. 1 copy of Mars, 2 copy of Red Card with a Guzma thrown in here. And then all of the other stuff that we would expect. 1 Leaf, 1 Rocky Helmet, 1 Giant Cape, 1 Red, 1 Sabrina, 1 Cyrus. And then 2 Pokemon Center Lady, which is a little bit interesting, but I think actually makes a lot of sense, especially given how many players are playing Buzzwole and how many Buzzwole decks are utilizing Pheromosa. It really is kind of the best way, or I guess really the only chance of that matchup is to keep Giratina at high health. So with Giant Cape, Giratina goes to 170. With a couple Pokemon Center ladies, we can guarantee that Giratina never really falls down below that 120 or 140 HP threshold that it kind of, is in range of getting KO'd by something like a Buzzwole. So yeah, I think that it kind of makes a lot of sense given the format right now and what decks are common. Hand Disruption in general is very, very good right now. I think it actually does well against Buzzwole, but also against Rampardos and Sylvally. Those are decks that rely on combo pieces, typically late in the game, to win. If you're playing Buzzwole, you kind of do rely on like a Cyrus for game or maybe a Lusamine to set up, your last Pokemon and then win. So being able to Mars your opponent down to, of course, one, or I guess, yeah, it's always really just going to be one card in their hand if you're playing Giratina Darkrai. That oftentimes is the difference between you winning or losing. So it's not always a guarantee. Of course, if you Mars your opponent down to one card and they draw a card, that's two cards that they have. I mean, late in the game, it's fairly likely that they're going to have one of the cards that they need to win, but it is, of course, something that's going to increase your odds. And then red card early game is actually quite good. So many scenarios, whether it's against, Solgaleo or it's against, of course, Rampardos, in Sylvally, it's really good to, negate maybe that first turn research that we see our opponents play all of the time. A lot of times, like in Pokemon Pocket, your opponent maybe goes first or second, whatever it is, on their first turn. They play research, they stack up, 5-6 cards in their hand, whatever it is, and then they pass. So playing that red card is certainly really good. We can also draw Professor's Research or play Professor's Research and draw into red card, which is why it's just really valuable. So it's able to kind of turn the tides. These are cards, when I say Hand Disruption, I mean, things like Mars and red card. And these are cards that realistically are here to mostly just level the playing field. Of course, Mars does have its applications late in the game to reduce the odds of your opponent having that final card that they need to win the game. But most of the time, I kind of just refer to it as like card advantage, right? How many cards are in your deck as opposed to your opponent's? Most of the time, if you have, 5 cards in your deck, but your opponent has 10 cards in their deck, you're probably in a winning situation. That's kind of how Pokemon Pocket goes. So these are really the only cards that can kind of negate being behind on card advantage by your opponent maybe drawing into a couple of Professor's Researches early. So you got to keep that in mind. Giratina and Darkrai, man. A lot of Hand Disruption in here, a couple of healing cards as well. I think honestly makes a whole lot of sense. Now, I will say that Giratina and Darkrai doesn't have like a phenomenal matchup against really the overall field right now, the format and all of the decks that people are playing. But, in Pokemon Pocket, I mean, variance is the number one factor no matter what, right? So theoretically, we could have losing matchups against all of the decks in Top Cut, but all we have to do is maybe get a little bit lucky, or maybe our opponents get a little bit unlucky, and then, of course, we're playing Giratina and Darkrai, so we can always win, and I think that's really the upside to it. Again, I don't want people to really overreact with Giratina and Darkrai winning this week. I do think it's a really great deck, but do I think it's the best deck of the format right now? No, I don't. I'm just going to flat out say it. I don't even know if it's actually the second best deck. In fact, it probably isn't even. So again, the third, fourth, fifth, sixth best decks in the game can still win tournaments, right? It's just how it goes. Just because a deck wins a tournament doesn't mean it's the best deck, and just because it's the best deck doesn't mean it's going to win a tournament. That is the difference between correlation and causation, right? Something I always talk about, especially in the Discord. People in the Discord definitely know what I'm talking about. All right, so let's break down, these Buzzwole decks that got second place, third place, and fourth place. You may notice that Limitless categorizes these decks a bit differently. Again, we have another one of those situations similar to how Giratina decks were categorized on the tournament platform last format. We see they're categorized in two different ways. We have Buzzwole and Pheromosa, and Buzzwole and Celesteela. You might be like, what's the difference between the two? We'll get into it, but basically it chalks down to whether or not you're playing, 2 copies of Pheromosa, or maybe you're playing, a Kartana or 2 copies of Kartana and 1 Pheromosa. That's then broken down as Buzzwole and Celesteela, because you're always going to be playing 2 Celesteelas. So anyway, that's kind of how Limitless does it for whatever reason. It might change, but for now, it is kind of segmenting the Buzzwole decks into 2 categories. Let's take a look here at the second place Buzzwole deck, which is going to be utilizing predominantly the Pheromosa, Cyrus, and red card combination here. I think this is kind of smart, right? So red card and Mars. So this is the Buzzwole deck that is playing its own Hand Disruption. Of course, going to be really good just in a variety of different decks in the format. I think that Hand Disruption right now is maybe better than it ever has been. A lot of the best decks and the most played decks of the format are all playing sort of the rare candy combination. Even in the matchups against the mirror matchup, where of course Buzzwole's playing all basic Pokemon, they still utilize things like Lusamine to kind of get up and running. So it is definitely good, and I think Hand Disruption probably has a really significant place in the metagame right now. So this deck is, again, it's a deck that I actually played on stream a lot last night, and it's definitely a good deck list. I think a lot of people are maybe trying to figure out about Buzzwole. Should I be playing Kartana? Should I be playing Pheromosa? That's really the significant question. I think there are certainly advantages to running either. This deck list here got second place, but what I will say is that decks playing multiple Kartanas actually ended up doing a little bit better overall in the tournament. Again, all stuff we'll really get into, but this Buzzwole deck playing 2 Buzzwole, 2 Celesteela, and then 2 Pheromosa, and no Kartana, that opens up another slot in the deck to maybe play a second Cyrus, or maybe even play a red card and a Mars. We are playing 2 Ericas, which is a bit interesting, and only 1 copy of Lusamine. So even though this deck list did get second place in the tournament, I don't know if I would really recommend playing 1 Lusamine personally. In my experience playing this deck, both on the ranked ladder and, well, yeah, just, playing in Master Ball rank, really, I feel like 2 Lusamine is honestly kind of needed in this deck list. I know some people might disagree with that, but I think that overall, it is kind of our most oftentimes our win condition card. So I feel very strongly that 2 Lusamine is just really, really important. I do think all of the other cards in this deck are really good. And of course, because we're playing 2 Pheromosa, the Pheromosa Cyrus combo is kind of our main win condition. But one thing I will say, and probably a significant reason why this particular deck lost to Giratina and Darkrai, is because Pheromosa does get countered by a variety of different sort of, healing cards or things like a Giant Cape, which of course, Pheromosa only does 20 damage to a single target. So yes, of course, it can set up KOs for Buzzwole. And of course, you can't damage a bench Pokemon to then bring it up with Cyrus, but if your opponent is playing, multiple healing cards and they're playing Giant Cape, it's not as consistent of an option as maybe something like a Kartana is. Excuse me, which can just put in a bunch of extra pressure. It's basically just the difference between doing 20 to one Pokemon and 20 to a second Pokemon, or just doing 40 to a single Pokemon. It really just kind of comes down to whether or not your opponent is playing healing cards, which again, kind of does disrupt Pheromosa a little bit more than it does Kartana. So you got to keep that in mind for sure. But anyway, I think this list is really, really good. I will also say that Pheromosa, or not playing Kartana rather, is probably not super advantageous in the mirror matchup. We typically do see that in the Buzzwole mirror. Decks that are playing Kartana are just a little bit better than in the mirror matchup, at least against the decks that aren't playing Kartana. And yeah, that's just sort of the case. Again, it comes down because in the mirror matchup, your opponent is probably playing Ericas and Leaf Cape, so Pheromosa isn't just as useful as Kartana, right, at kind of whittling down your opponent and putting them within KO range, and that's really all it comes down to. So I think Pheromosa Cyrus, in general, is actually better than playing Kartana. But again, I think a lot of people are counterplaying the whole Pheromosa thing with all of the healing cards and whatnot, so I actually think Kartana is probably a bit better. It's also better in the mirror matchup, but this deck list did get second place. So again, going a little bit more into context as to kind of what I believe in. Anyway, third place deck, let's take a look at it. This is going to be a little bit different. This deck list is playing, it's actually quite similar in fact. In fact, I think all we did was cut 1 Cyrus and 1 red card for 1 Lusamine and then 1 Kartana. So again, this is sort of a more in the middle deck. It's kind of, kind of floating between, sort of the 2 different styles that we're seeing. It's kind of matching them together. We're still playing 2 Pheromosa. We're still playing Cyrus. We're still playing Mars. So a little bit of hand disruption. But instead of playing, no Kartana, we're just including 1. Again, it does make it a little bit awkward because you don't know whether or not you're going to be able to utilize Kartana or Pheromosa when you need it to. Obviously, more often we're going to get Pheromosa than Kartana, but it is what it is, right? The deck list in general is going to function similarly. At least we have 1 Kartana and at least 1 Pheromosa to do either. And then again, 2 Lusamine and 1 Cyrus. So I oftentimes do feel like Lusamine is just a better win condition, or more oftentimes a win condition than Cyrus is. So it makes more sense to play 2 Lusamine instead of 2 Cyrus. But in general, I don't necessarily know. We'll have to wait and see, I guess, what people settle on. But Buzzwole's a really interesting one because there are kind of a variety of different ways in which we can build the deck and center the deck around. You could even, in this scenario, cut a Mars and just play, maybe like a Repel or a Sabrina. And I think it also could be completely justifiable. 1 Mars, Mars is just really, really good. It honestly is. Yeah, anyway. That is going to be the third place Buzzwole deck. And now let's take a look at a Buzzwole deck that is categorized as Buzzwole and Celesteela. And here, basically, we see that we're playing 2 Kartana in this list and 1 Pheromosa. So all 3 of these Buzzwole decks really do give you sort of an image of, I guess, the whole spectrum of ways that we can play Buzzwole, which is interesting. And I wouldn't put too much stock in like, this Buzzwole deck got, second, and this one got third, and this one got fourth. It really doesn't matter that much, like the standings here, right? These are all decks that are that were all in top 4, right? So I mean, like basically they all did the same in terms of the results of the tournament. And like I said, there's a lot of different ways we can play Buzzwole. These 3 decks that we're taking a look at today really encompass all of the different kind of aspects of the deck in which we can build. So this is 2 Kartana, and this is playing Erica's. Only 1 copy, 2 Lusamine still, 1 Cyrus still, and then 1 red card instead of 1 Mars, and then again 2 Kartana instead of 1 Pheromosa. So we're kind of getting a full, and 1 red as well, which is actually a little bit interesting. So I think red actually does have a place in Buzzwole, and it certainly can be a really good option. In the mirror matchup, it kind of does bypass the need to kind of whittle down with Pheromosa or Kartana. So red is also just an alternate win condition card. In the mirror matchup, Guzma is going to provide more value than red, of course, but there are scenarios where you can Guzma off the Leaf Cape, bring them back down to 140, and then the next turn KO them for 140, right, with red. So playing both Guzma and red in there is definitely a lot of extra sort of damage modification to discard, you know, the capes and then to do that extra damage, right? So it's a little bit more focused around that, less hand disruption, less sort of gusting, as we see only 1 Cyrus. So yeah. Again, Repel we haven't seen in these top 3 decks, but Repel is certainly a really strong card that you can play in Buzzwole. So I think, honestly, we've yet to see. I think Buzzwole is certainly a deck that's going to be played a variety of different ways. The styles all change a little bit. It is going to kind of very minutely change how the deck operates, but overall, I will say that Buzzwole might actually end up being, in my mind, the strongest or the best deck of the current format right now. We'll have to wait and see for the tier list tomorrow. Next up here, let's take a look at Red Japan's deck at 5th place, which was Solgaleo and Shiinotic. So Solgaleo is really interesting. I spent a lot of time really disrespecting Solgaleo last format, and that's because last format, Solgaleo and Skarmory, I really didn't think was a great deck, but Solgaleo has returned, and it's actually better now than it ever has been with the inclusion of Shiinotic. And I don't know if a lot of people necessarily understand what makes Shiinotic really good with Solgaleo. I think it really just comes down to the fact that, you know, Solgaleo can kind of carry its own. It really is a Pokemon that once it kind of comes in, it can kind of just carry the game. We are playing Lily, we're playing Red for some extra damage, and of course we're playing Cyrus and we're playing Sabrina, so we've got some Gust as well. Solgaleo just has a ton of HP, and it can attack for only 2 energies, and of course we can attack with multiple Solgaleos, and we can set multiple up, right? Because of course it has a low energy attack cost, and it can kind of retreat for free, which is really good. Well, not retreat for free, but it can come in for free, right, from the bench. And I think, honestly, that's why we're seeing Shiinotic paired with Solgaleo, and not maybe paired with that many other Pokemon. The cool thing about this deck list is that Shiinotic really is a card that doesn't do anything other than basically thin the cards out of your deck and increase the opportunities we have to get into Solgaleo. Whether Shiinotic does 0 damage doesn't really matter, and whether it gets KO'd early, it doesn't really matter. The whole aspect of this deck is to play these 4 cards that potentially just sort of thin more cards out of your deck and allow you to draw more consistently into the Solgaleo. Whether these get KO'd or not really doesn't matter that much. It's just here to kind of buy time and to kind of blaze through our deck, hopefully. Also, you can kind of daisy chain Shiinotics if you get a couple more levels down. It is kind of strong to, of course, maybe evolve into Shiinotic, you know, Illuminate, find a second Shiinotic, evolve, Illuminate, and then on your next turn, you can just Illuminate twice. It really is kind of crazy. You can just pull a ton of cards out of your deck. And if we're pulling all of the Pokemon out of our deck, then of course we have a lot more of a higher chance in the late game to have any of our trainer cards that we kind of need, right? Whether to Rare Candy into Solgaleo or just to have our Red or our Lily or a Cyrus or a Mars or whatever it is that's going to be our win condition. That's really what the deck is all about, right? So before we were pairing Skarmory with Solgaleo, and it was okay, it was fine, but Solgaleo wasn't very much that consistently coming into play, right? And if you didn't draw into Solgaleo, you just lost the game. The thing with this deck is that you're more often than not going to draw into the Solgaleo, and that is definitely an upside. For sure. Now, unfortunately, going first against Skarmory does feel kind of bad, but going second is actually quite good. Solgaleo is a card that can deal with Skarmory really, really easily. It can just kind of KO stuff, right? You can force your opponent to basically KO Shiinotic with like their Rampardos or something, or we can just live a hit from Rampardos and then just sort of KO. So there's a lot of scenarios where Solgaleo is just sort of overpowering on the other top decks of the format. Particularly, I think this deck came into the metagame because it was actually quite good against both Buzzwole and then also probably Rampardos and Sylvally, which is definitely an upside. The deck inherently is a little bit inconsistent, and of course it can lose to either of those matchups. Both of those decks going second might even have an advantage, I'm not sure. But Solgaleo, even though this is a card that has a really high upside, has a pretty low downside, and truthfully, I think has the potential to beat really any of the top decks in the metagame, and even have like kind of winning matchups. We'll take a look at the matchup spreads and the win rates later in the video. But yeah, Solgaleo is a really, really interesting deck. much better right now than I think it ever has been. And I think, again, the main reason why we're able to pair Shiinotic with Solgaleo so well and not maybe some other EX Pokemon is because of the Rising Road ability that allows us to kind of just park our Shiinotics or Immortals in the active spot, and then we never have to attach with it. We don't have to play Leaf. We can just bring up our attacking Solgaleo whenever we need to because of its ability, and I think that's really, really, really strong. Also, 180 HP with Lily is enough to live a couple of attacks against, again, most things in the format. Red is interesting. I do think Red brings us to a 140, and that, of course, is enough to KO a Buzzwole without Leaf Cape, but they are playing 2 copies of Leaf Cape, so I don't know how I feel necessarily about playing Red. Maybe I would rather just play Giovanni so I could hit for 130 on a Rampardos, even though I guess Rampardos is 150 HP, so I guess it doesn't really matter. Buzzwole does hit for weakness, so 130 is a KO, but with Solgaleo, it's not, right? We're not hitting for weakness, so anyway, yeah, there's Solgaleo. Something that I think maybe some people are a little bit curious about as to like maybe why it sees play or why it's so good. I think it is actually quite good into this current format, even though it got 5th place. It was, I think, the 3rd or 4th most played deck of the format. We'll take a look in a little bit. And yeah, didn't really see any other placements other than 19th, but did have a pretty good performance this week, I will say. And then all the way down at 6th place, Nabrix here from the United States was playing Sylvally Rampardos. So Sylvally Rampardos was the most played deck of this tournament, and I think is probably the most common deck of this early format. Didn't find its way into top 4, and in fact, its highest placement was 6th, and then second highest placement was 9th. So it wasn't necessarily like the most highest performing deck of this first weekend, but I think this deck is still really, really phenomenal. A big reason why it maybe didn't do so well was because so many people were playing Buzzwole. It was like right behind it in Metashare, and of course, I do think Buzzwole has a winning matchup against Sylvally and Rampardos. Whether we're playing Pheromosa or Kartana, we certainly seem to have kind of the upside in that matchup, especially if we're going second. Sylvally is something I think a lot of people are a little bit frustrated with, but I think honestly the main issue is Rampardos. The upside to pairing Sylvally with Rampardos is that, of course, it's a fossil Pokemon. So you're guaranteed to start with Type Null. And because we're always guaranteed to start with Type Null, going second, we're almost guaranteed always to get this Brave Buddies attack off with Sylvally. So that means that, theoretically speaking, we're doing 20 to 40 damage, right, with Type Null. If we're doing 40, that's significant because next turn we're doing 100, especially if we're going second. So in 2 turns, we're doing either 120 or 140 damage. That is a lot. I mean, that is really a lot for how consistent of a leadoff Sylvally really ends up being. And then because Rampardos can attack for only 1 energy, after we do attack with Sylvally, maybe take a KO, we can always just go into Rampardos. And because it can attack for 1 energy, we can bring it up and attack at any time. It really is kind of incredible. Now, fortunately, Rampardos is weak to grass, so things like a Buzzwole or Pheromosa or Kartana can definitely take KOs a lot of the times, which is why I think Buzzwole has a winning matchup. Also, Celesteela can live an attack from Sylvally. On top of that, of course, we have Pheromosa, we have Kartana, and we can kind of pivot out for free with Celesteela. So there's a lot of definitely upside to the Buzzwole matchup against this particular deck. I do think this deck is really, really, really strong. I think Sylvally's really strong. It's seeing play right now in a variety of decks, whether it's with Rampardos, or maybe it's seeing play with Charizard, or other fire decks, maybe with Incineroar, or maybe it's just seeing play with Electric-type decks, maybe like with Oricorio. Sylvally's really, really good, really consistent, and it's just a great leadoff. I will say that it's much less good unless you're like paired with things that aren't fossils, right? Because then you're not guaranteed to start with it. But either way, it's an incredible, incredible Pokemon. And Rampardos in general is just really, really strong. 130 for 1 energy is crazy, especially in a rare candy format. So yeah, that's really all I have to say about this deck. I think we all kind of know and understand what's going on with Sylvally Rampardos. I will say it kind of struggles against the other 2 decks that are very commonly played, that being Solgaleo and Buzzwole. But if you're going second, you can always win with Sylvally. In fact, this deck list is not playing Giant Cape, but I have seen some people pair or play Giant Cape with Sylvally to bring it up to 130. That can be really frustrating, especially for Buzzwole players looking to take a KO on Sylvally. But this deck list is playing Iono, which I think you kind of need to with the fossils. This is a deck that has to play, when you're playing Sylvally, you have to play a lot of supporter cards because that enables Sylvally to do the damage it has to do. Luckily, we have Gladion, and I honestly think that Sylvally without Gladion wouldn't be nearly as good. It's basically 2 free supporter cards that we can play that not only allow you to find Sylvally, but find your other type nulls and just kind of, I guess, It's a supporter card that we can almost always use to utilize, or I guess satisfy the condition of Brave Buddies to do the full 100 damage. It really does make this deck absolutely incredible. We are playing one copy of Giovanni, which you may have noticed. This is here really to do 140 damage with Rampardos to then take a KO on a Buzzwole, which is why I think playing 2 copies of Leaf Cape and Buzzwole is definitely correct. But Giovanni is there predominantly for that one reason. So I would definitely recommend to play Leaf Cape in your Buzzwoles. That way you're not getting KO'd by Rampardos. And yeah, Sylvally Rampardos, man, it is just, it's really good, but didn't have maybe as dominant as a first weekend here as maybe some people estimated it would. Let's take a look here at Shadow Rex. From Netherlands, playing Charizard and Incineroar. So, you know, I have a lot of opinions about Charizard in this current format. Of course, yesterday I did upload a video of Charizard in Sylvally, which I thought is a really good counter to a lot of the top decks in the format right now. I think that Charizard does well against Buzzwole, right? We can get a KO even with Leaf Cape on the Buzzwole, hitting for weakness for 170. And then, of course, we are KOing Solgaleo for 170, especially since they do 10 damage to themselves after they attack. So that is very significant. We're playing 2 copies of Lily. This is a deck that kind of just wins if you get more than one Charizard out, or if you get Charizard out early and your opponent just doesn't really have an answer to it. Yeah, 150 every other turn, like starting from your 3rd turn, is really strong, especially with 2 copies of Lily in the deck. And we're playing 1 red card and 1 Mars, which is in general just crazy. 1 red to maybe KO things that you know, have a lot of HP that aren't, I guess, you know, weak to fire. Maybe things like a Giant Cape Giratina. There's a couple of different decks, like Gallade is seeing a little bit of play. Maybe even the mirror matchup as well, although I guess we're not hitting for 180, but you know what I mean. And yeah, this is the traditional Charizard deck when paired with Incineroar. You know, the tier list is going to be interesting for me because Charizard can see play in so many different decks. The fire type right now is really interesting because there's so many different ways that people are playing all of the fire decks. You've got Charizard and Incineroar, you have Charizard and Turtonator, you've got Incineroar Turtonator, you've got Charizard Sylvally, you've got Incineroar Sylvally, there's even Blacephalon maybe thrown in there. So there's so many different ways we can play fire. I think that Charizard Incineroar, again, has such a tremendous upside that it does kind of provide a little bit extra value above maybe playing, you know, some of the cards that aren't also just stage 2, you know, EX Pokemon. Like, that's what the deck really comes down to is like, you know, are we really able to just get one of these stage 2 EXs out early? And if we do, we're probably gonna have a pretty good chance. That's really where Charizard kind of comes into its own here. No water types in the format. And again, ton of HP. We have Lily, we're doing a lot of damage. Strong against Buzzwole, strong against, you know, Solgaleo. Might struggle a bit against Sylvally, I'm not gonna lie, but yeah, just a really, really strong deck. I actually am pretty high on Charizard right now, given the kind of current meta landscape. The one downside to playing this particular deck is that we kind of lose to Oricorio. So that's really it. But, you know, in this first week, Oricorio didn't really see that much play. I think it will probably uptick in play, as maybe we all assumed it would. But for now, I think Charizard is certainly really good as long as Oricorio doesn't see a ton of play. Getting 7th place here, which is interesting. I don't know how many people played it. We'll take a look in a little bit. And then here at 10th place, we have Garchomp. And I'm actually quite high on Garchomp. I think that it deserved to see more play. I think most people this first week ended up playing Rampardos with Sylvally for good reason. I think it's probably a little bit better, especially with all of the grass decks up in the format. Playing a deck where you're basically entirely weak to grass is certainly a downside. We are playing 2 copies of Lily, but Buzzwole hitting for 140 on us is pretty significant. Not only that, but Kartana hits for 60, Pheromosa hits for 40. There's a lot of scenarios where your opponent will be able to take a KO. Garchomp can use linear attack to damage a bench Pokemon. That's not as relevant in the Buzzwole matchup, but is very relevant in the Rampardos Sylvally matchup, which is, yeah, I think kind of one of the main upsides to playing Garchomp right now is that, you know, we're fairly decent into most of the decks other than Buzzwole, but we're actually quite good against other Rampardos decks, predominantly Sylvally, right, which is weak to fighting. So Garchomp is actually a really interesting deck. You're still playing the whole Rampardos stuff, so you can still do all of the crazy things that we typically do with Rampardos. Plus 2 copies of Lily does open up a lot of scenarios where Rampardos can also be healed with Lily, which is definitely significant, but really what it comes down to is that Garchomp is good against Sylvally Rampardos. And I think that for that one reason, I think it actually is pretty justified. And especially since Sylvally Rampardos might end up being kind of the most played deck for the next couple of weeks. Maybe next week it won't be the #1 most played deck, but it'll certainly be at the top of the meta share, and Garchomp has a good matchup against it. So I actually do like Garchomp. Probably going to be kind of a sneaky choice right now in the format, honestly, as far as like the legacy decks go from the previous formats. I think that Garchomp and Charizard are actually quite good. Maybe Charizard's maybe a little bit better than Garchomp right now, but I actually still really like Garchomp, particularly because it is actually quite good against Rampardos Sylvally. Of course, Dragon Claw will be getting a KO on a Sylvally, but on top of that, Rampardos can KO Sylvally, and then Garchomp can linear attack and one-hit KO a Fossil on turn 2 if we do Rare Candy into Garchomp. And that's just relevant. I mean, that's very, very relevant. So I think Garchomp is kind of a sleeper pick right now. And getting 10th place is no surprise, and also 17th place, which is pretty cool. I'm not going to lie. A lot of different decks, in fact. If we take a look at all of the decks in like top 16 and we count how many different archetypes there were, right? There's one here, so that's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, seven different decks here in like top 12, which is or top 14, which is quite balanced, honestly. I know some people think that this format might not be as, I guess, well balanced as last format. I think things are bound to change a lot in the next coming weeks, but yeah, actually quite a bit of variety in terms of all of the different decks that you could kind of justify playing right now. And I think that's kind of smart. One thing that we're not seeing here is Giratina and Giratina and Arceus here at 26th place. A deck that not many people played, but actually I think is still really good in the format. So we'll take a look at that in a little bit. Lastly, or next up, let's take a look at, well, we took a look at Garchomp. What are we taking? Oh, right here. Naganadel and Guzzlord. So yeah, the Dark Ultra Beast deck is certainly really good. Again, I just think that it had a little bit of a tough week. Every Pokemon in our deck is basically weak to either fighting or it's weak to grass. And that is tough because those are the two most common types in the format right now. I think that's really the only reason why these sort of dark type Ultra Beast decks maybe aren't seeing that much play. In the same vein, maybe not being that well performing. I think this deck is extremely strong. I think that Guzzlord is one of the best Pokemon in the game, and I think that the entire Ultra Beast package in the dark type is really, really strong. But unfortunately, I think it just comes down to weakness, and there's just too many Pokemon that are able to hit us for weakness. And Naganadel getting hit for extra damage on a Pheromosa and a Buzzwole and a Kartana is really, really important, right? We don't have a really consistent way to heal Guzzlord, so it's very, very common for us to just kind of get KO'd on turn 2 or turn 3, rather, and that's definitely kind of a downside to Guzzlord, especially since it's the Pokemon that's kind of supposed to be sitting in the active spot soaking up damage. However, Celesteela can do that. It just doesn't feel very good. This deck list can beat really anything with Poison Barb, the extra damage that we're doing with Nihilego, the energy discard, and then of course Lusamine, which allows us to kind of maybe lead off with a Naganadel or even attack with a Celesteela or something, or just go Guzzlord into another Guzzlord and set up for Tyrannical Hole really early. And that is quite strong. So it's kind of tricky in terms of like our ability to I guess extend into like the mid game is kind of where we struggle. But the late game is actually quite strong as long as we can kind of get Tyrannical Hole set up, and 120 is 120. But in the early game, we should definitely be able to put on some consistent pressure. Like I said, unfortunately, all of our Pokemon are weak to grass and fighting, and I really think that's kind of what this deck comes down to. You can kind of maybe cut some of the Pokemon in the deck, but they all provide value in some way or another, so it's kind of tough. This is a deck that's playing 10 Pokemon, so we only have 10 slots for trainer cards, and of course we're playing 2 Pokeball, 2 Research, and we're probably going to play 2 Poison Barb, which really only leaves 4 spots in the deck. Lusamine's a great option, and of course 1 Cyrus, 1 Mars. So that's kind of the downside to this deck, is that it's not super flexible, and you kind of have to play with the cards that are dealt to you, but honestly, it is still a really strong deck. I think it kind of just comes down to that main grass weakness on the Guzzlord, which is definitely a significant downside to it. But Wataru 0901 from Japan getting 14th place. Shout out to him. And shout out to all the other people that we maybe didn't, mention or I guess showcase their decks. Shout out to everybody for sure. And let's go all the way down real quick. And the last deck that we're going to take a look at is here in 26th place is going to be Giratina and Arceus. And Giratina Arceus is, I think, still a top deck of the format. This was a deck that was very dominant in the previous format, and I think it's still really, really good. Yes, mostly all of our Pokemon are weak to grass and fighting, just like the Guzzlord deck. But Arceus or Giratina and Darkrai paired with Arceus and Crobat allows us to basically extend and be able to KO anything in the game. And that's the upside. That's truthfully the main upside for this deck, is that theoretically speaking, like a Giratina hitting for 130, plus a Darkrai ping doing 150, plus a Crobat, Cunning Link ping does what is it, 180, and that you're getting a KO on anything. So again, this is a deck with a super high upside. It is a little bit of a solitaire deck. Just getting all of your Pokemon out can be a challenge, but if you do get your Pokemon out, if your opponent just maybe bricks for a little bit and you can get everything set up, then yeah, we should be able to just kind of steamroll through our opponent and KO basically anything that's in front of us. That's really what this deck list is all about. And I think even though it didn't see a lot of play, all of the players that played this deck actually performed quite well and had pretty consistent win rates across the board. So I actually still think that Arceus, Giratina, and Darkrai, even though from a representation perspective, really hasn't seen that much play, at least in the first week or so, I think probably will rise up as still a predominant archetype that definitely deserves some consideration and deserves to see a lot of play. As far as these high roll decks go with a ton of potential, this is definitely up there as far as just one of the strongest decks in the game. Again, being able to do 180 damage with the full combo is just kind of crazy. It really, really is. So anyway, guys, that's all of the deck lists in terms of the final standings. Now what we're going to do is go into the metagame tab, take a look at the meta shares, the win rates, all of that good stuff. I know a lot of people maybe aren't super interested in this part of the video, but one thing I will say is that this is really where it comes down to. I say it all the time, don't put that much stock in the decks that place at the top of the rankings. It's not necessarily about that. And if you're interested in how all of this data and all of this information translates into ranked mode, that's really what we're going to get into here in the metagame tab, because I think that's really where the correlation fits quite well. So let's get right into it. The metagame tab is right here. And as we see, Sylvally Rampardos, the most played deck of the format, 20% of the meta share. That's more than any deck had last format, I believe, in an Ursa Days tournament. So very dominant in terms of, the meta share this week. 20% is pretty significant, and it did go just about 51.5% win rate, 544 to 489, and 18 ties. And this includes, again, all of the matchups against itself, which means it actually did fairly well for a deck that had this high of a meta share. So that's important to note. Again, the more people that play a deck, the more closely its win rate falls to 50%, because it's more oftentimes playing itself. And if it's playing itself, it of course is going to have a 50% win rate, right? So anyway, there you go. So I think that's actually a very decent win rate for a deck that was 20% of the meta share, I will say. So it had a pretty good performance. Buzzwole and Pheromosa was the second most played deck at 10% of the meta share. But again, it's split up into two, right? We have Buzzwole and Celesteela, which again is technically different. We did take a look at why they're different. But this was 5% of the meta share. So if you combine the two, Buzzwole in total was about 15% of the meta share. And that is, of course, about just 5% less. But definitely the second most played deck of the format, which is, interesting for sure. And Buzzwole did really good, 293 to 251. That's a 53% win rate. And then Buzzwole Celesteela with a smaller sample size was 134 to 100, and that's a 56% win rate. So again, if we add these up, we've got, let's do some quick math, I suppose. That's 300 or 427. So 427 to 351. So that's a pretty good win rate overall. I don't know what percentage that is, of course, but that is certainly a really good win rate. Buzzwole, to me, was probably one of the more higher performing decks of this particular tournament. And in my mind, it kind of was the number one deck, even though it didn't get first place and it wasn't the most played deck. I do think it kind of was the number one deck overall. But anyway, Giratina and Darkrai, still the third most played deck of the tournament, but had a sub 50% win rate, which is interesting, right? So out of all of the decks that saw a lot of play, maybe Sans, Giratina, and Magnezone, it actually had kind of the lowest win rate, right, out of all of these top 5 most played decks, which, to me is no surprise. I mean, I think Giratina and Darkrai is totally fine, but in the same vein, I really don't think it's that good into this kind of current, field that we have for this format, right? So kind of the lowest win rate we've honestly ever seen from Giratina and Darkrai, which is ironic because it ended up getting first place in the tournament. But again, I always tell you, the final standings aren't really, what's that important when we're analyzing the metagame. Of course, it's maybe a little bit surprising that it got first place, but I'm really not that surprised. 50% win rate isn't that great. Again, it did underperform compared to all of the other, most played decks of the format. But then let's take a look here at Solgaleo and Shiinotic, which did have a 56% win rate at just under 5% of the meta share, 148 to 109. So a smaller sample size, but a pretty decent win rate overall. And then, of course, Buzzwole and then Charizard here, a little bit under 50%. So it did struggle overall. Charizard Turtonator definitely struggled at 32 and 60. So to me, that shows that Turtonator, and I know it's a small sample size, but Turtonator might not be good against all of the most common decks of the format. No real surprise there. Turtonator's a little bit inconsistent, even though I think Charizard's good. Decidueye did okay, 51%. Again, very small sample size here at 2%. Charizard Wigglytuff, very bad win rate here, only 26%. Meowscarada definitely struggled. That's no surprise with Sylvally and Rampardos being so common. Guzzlord and Naganadel, again, also struggled. Arceus and Crobat, that's with Carnivine, struggled this tournament. Again, these are smaller sample sizes. Charizard, Sylvally, I would say struggled, but again, it's such a small sample size. It was 23 and 28, so it didn't have like a great record in a small sample size, but it wasn't like, I guess, terrible. And then look at this, Giratina and Arceus. So again, very small sample, but 55 and 29. So in a small sample size, this deck list did quite well. Out of the 12 players playing this deck, I mean, basically almost all of them had like winning records, which is kind of impressive. I think this deck probably deserves to see a bit more play. And then everything else below here probably isn't really worth looking at in terms of a win rate perspective. But anyway, one thing that I love to do right now, which I think is one of the best sort of data calculations that we can do, is that given the meta shares, we can see the difference between the overall meta share of the tournament and then the meta shares for day 2, which is again what we call like a day 2 conversion rate. So let's quickly take a look at that right now. So let's go one by one. So Sylvally Rampardos was 20% of the tournament overall, and then if we go into day 2, it was 26.5% of day 2. So definitely about a 6% increase from day 1 to day 2 in terms of getting into day 2. However, it didn't do very well in day 2. As we see here, only a 41% win rate, went 12 and 17. So Sylvally Rampardos had a really good day 2 conversion rate, but struggled against a lot of the decks that it ended up facing in day 2. I think kind of significantly decreasing its sort of overall value. And again, why we kind of saw it maybe not do so well in the final standings. Sylvally Rampardos, to me, what it tells me is that that's a really good deck into like a bunch of the random stuff that we see in the format, like into all of this stuff, right? Into all of these decks. Sylvally Rampardos is certainly really strong, but once you get into day 2 and you face basically all of the best decks of the format, it's going to struggle a little bit. So that gives us definitely valuable context. Let's go back here. We see Buzzwole Pheromosa was only 10% of the tournament, and in Playing to Win, it was 17%. So that's also about a 7% jump in day 2 meta share. So certainly really interesting. Had a really good outing as well. 16 and 11 is certainly very, very interesting. So shout out to Buzzwole. Darkrai Giratina, so 7% of the meta share at a 49% win rate. In day 2, it was 10% of the meta share, and then 65%. So about an even conversion rate in terms of getting into day 2, but actually did really well in day 2, which is interesting for sure to note, honestly. Yeah, again, that could be variance, right? It could be the matchups that it hit. But anyway, let's next up take a look at Solgaleo and Shiinotic, which was only 4.5% of the meta share at 56% win rate. And then in day 2, it had a 12%, jumped up a lot. So Solgaleo and Shiinotic also did really well in day 1, but kind of struggled in day 2 in a much lower win rate. Buzzwole Celesteela went from 7.8, or sorry, we got to go back. Buzzwole Celesteela went from only 5% meta share, 56% win rate to, what was it? Only 8% or 8. So it jumped up actually, I think, to 8% and then about a 54% win rate at 6 and 5. So yeah, it's interesting, right? These were all of the other decks that made day 2. Giratina, Arceus, a couple, Charizard and Cinnamoroar, a few, Garchomp, Guzzlord, Tapu Koko, another Guzzlord, Magnezone Giratina did make it, just straight Charizard made it, and then Solgaleo and Skarmory ended up making it as well. All of those decks did not end up winning a game, they just went 0-1. But yeah, interesting, right? It's kind of a lot of like data to take a look at, right? So like, it might be a little bit confusing in terms of like us just kind of throwing all those numbers out, but basically if I had to kind of, the way I think about it is like, if we're translating the metadata and the results from the tournament to like a ranked battles perspective, you kind of want to look at like the overall field, right? And that's kind of what the meta share and I guess the win rates from like day 1 and day 2 really showcase to us, and not so much like the final standings, right? The people who are still watching this video are getting a lot of valuable information if they're paying attention, right? So again, if we're going to go ahead and take a look at this and just sort of see like what decks did better in day 2, these are the decks that are good against like the most common decks of the format, right? So at the top of the metagame, which is probably what you're going to see in like a high Master Ball tier, things like Giratina and Darkrai might be quite good, and things like Buzzwole might be quite good, but things like Solgaleo or Sylvally might struggle a little bit. But in a larger scheme, maybe in the lower ranks, things like, of course, Solgaleo might be really, really good, or Sylvally and Rampardos might be even better, right? So you got to keep that in mind, right? That's sort of the difference between ranked battles and tournament data. It's valuable data to take a look at, although you just got to use the data correctly, and you've got to kind of correlate it correctly to kind of what's going on in ranked battles. We'll talk about it more, I think, as the week goes on. But anyway, guys, that is it. That's Meta Monday. That is the first tournament of the new metagame. And yeah, really interesting. What did you guys think? Comment down below. Let me know what you guys thought of the results. What do you think is the best deck right now? Personally, I think that Buzzwole probably takes that crown, but there's actually quite a bit of variety and parity at the top of this metagame, which I think is really fun. And we're probably going to see it change a lot in terms of which decks see more play and which decks actually, didn't see play this week might even, rise up. I mean, some decks are just going to be brand new, right? So it's going to be really interesting to see. But yeah, comment below. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. Stay tuned. Tomorrow is going to be our tier list, and you're not going to want to miss it because I've got some spicy takes, and you might, feel free to kind of disagree and tell me how wrong I am in the comments tomorrow. I can't wait. But anyway, guys, let's get out of here. Peace out. Have a good one. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay tuned for all of the content that we've got coming up. I'm really, really excited. Pokemon Pocket's really, really fun, and it has been fun for the last couple of months. So I'm really excited about what's been going on in the game. So yeah. All right, guys. Peace out. Have a good one. We'll see you guys later. And yeah. Bye.